What precisely were you trying to do when you set out on this project? I'm very struck watching the movie. I don't know if you've heard similar reactions from people, but watching it, I felt like I was watching something that happened 40 or 50 years ago.
I've never had the experience as a filmmaker of making something that has, the film has sort of two narratives when people watch it now. There's the narrative of the film, which is really an emotional journey inside the foreign policy machine of our government during, an very eventful year with interesting characters who have their own sort of narrative arcs. There's that, and there's the counter narrative of what's in our minds, counterposing what's on the screen with everything that we're experiencing in the world today, and that makes for a very exciting viewing experience. And so to make a film that's about recent history, but actually speaks directly to this moment that we're in a way that none of us could really have anticipated, is exciting, and that's why I'm excited to finally, after 2.5 years on this project, to take it out into the wider world and let people experience it for themselves.
Yeah, I think that rings true to me. I think the moment when you show Samantha and Ben reacting to the presidential election is one of the most brutal things I've seen in a while, especially I never thought I would see Ben incapable of speech.
Not my, that's not the reputation I have,
Yeah, so it was a bit of a shock, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about the election, and in some ways, Trump didn't appear out of thin air. Like we had Sarah Palin in the 2008 campaign, and we had the Tea Party, and we had this kind of crass political opposition in parts of our experience, and we're running a marathon. We're trying to get all these things done, and the film is kind of the 26th mile of the marathon, and it's like we're reaching out to hand the baton off to somebody, and there's a hand there, and then suddenly it's gone. And what I'm processing there is the combination of thinking about all the things I worked on, the Cuba opening and the Iran deal and the Paris Climate Accord, and the sense of, well, what is going to happen to those things. But I think more profoundly, just a sense that we were trying to represent a certain approach to the world, a certain worldview that Obama had, which is very globalist and very inclusive and very much trying to speak to the better elements of America and the possibilities of engagement among peoples. And it's not just a Republican one. I mean, if Jeb Bush had won or Marco Rubio, that would have been recognizable, even if I wouldn't have liked the result. It was a sense of hurtling into an unknown, and an unknown that was defined by what I'd found to be the ugliest parts of the last 8 years: birtherism, kind of nativism, xenophobia, opposition to everything Barack Obama did because he was Barack Obama. And so I'm kind of absorbing all of that at once in real time. And yes, I probably to a fault, I'm not usually without words, but I was definitely speechless.
Towards the end of the movie, there's this moment when you mention that. You say, the president believed in this kind of globalist vision, multilateral vision, where people get together and they talk and they come up with some kind of rational thing. And that is happening at the same moment when you're colliding with this wave of authoritarianism and nationalism, because that world of authoritarianism and nationalism is the one we're living in now, or it feels that way.
It does, and one of the things people undervalue in foreign policy is like, who are your interlocutors? And even before Trump and Brexit, Barack Obama didn't have a lot of natural partners. I mean, there was Angela Merkel, and he had a great relationship with her, and there were some people he could get things done with, but the political moment in a lot of places was becoming more nationalist and was in a reaction to globalization. And so there's something very interesting, historically stepping back to think about the fact that we had this president who literally is the advertisement for what globalization can achieve. A man whose father's from Africa, whose mother worked in Indonesia, who was able to access opportunity because of the changes in American society, and represented that belief that things are getting better, that there's an arc of progress, that we're able to see past differences and our identities don't have to be factionalist. That he's president at a time when Putin is kind of coming back on the scene in Russia, in his second incarnation as president, and Xi Jinping is beginning to take a more nationalist turn in China, and that's not even beginning to get into the Middle East and how much things are devolving into sectarian conflict, and Europe is unable to kind of climb out of the hangover of the financial crisis. There was a sense even before Trump that Obama's historical moment was not always in tune with the moments in other places. And when we could make it come into tune, we could do things. The Paris Accord, we could make everybody realize that this is an issue we all have to get behind, and we're going to spend 7 years building this agreement. But then in a lot of other spaces, he was not blessed with people who were inhabiting the same moment as him.
So Samantha, there's a great moment in the movie when you say, I probably don't have it precisely right, but you say, and you're speaking the context of the Syrian civil war, and you say, you've got to be careful with the Russians. If you allow them to bully people, they'll just go and bully more. And of course, that brings up the really massive story of 2016 that doesn't end up getting much space in the film. I wouldn't really have expected it to, I guess, which is the Russian hacking, for lack of a better word, of our election. What did you hear about that particular story at the time, and do you feel in retrospect that the Obama administration did enough to push back against Putin?
I didn't hear, what was interesting about that is the compartment it kind of went into in the U.S. government was a cyber compartment. Right. They had hacked the DNC and they were releasing these materials, and it kind of went into a cell of people who think about cybersecurity. And then for some good reason that, we wanted to secure the election infrastructure. And then there was a statement made on October 7th about the fact that there was Russian meddling, which we thought was a very dramatic statement. But then that night, the Access Hollywood tape came out, and then John Podesta's emails conspicuously come out at the same time, and it kind of just got subsumed in the noise of our election. When I look back on it, I do think that, I think Barack Obama just talking more about Russia and meddling, I just don't know that we could have done that, sure. I mean, I acknowledge, people say, more noise about that could have been in order. I can see that argument. The problem is I don't know that would have made any difference. Trump would have said the election's rigged, and it would have been a he said, she said thing. What I do think about is, from a foreign policy perspective, starting in Ukraine, we did see Russia's information operations capacity. So put aside hacking, their ability to create and disseminate fake news, and how that would influence Russian-speaking publics in Ukraine and in the Baltics, and we saw them beginning to meddle in European politics. I was thinking about that as a foreign policy challenge. How do we talk to the Europeans about blunting this, correcting disinformation, joint cells? We were actually building an infrastructure to deal with Russian information operations around the world. From a National Security Council perspective, we actually just didn't have a lever to pull it home. We didn't have the ability to go to Facebook and say, X percentage of your news is fake that people are sharing on their feeds. And what was missing, I think, was a discussion between the tech sector and government about this. And I think what people don't fully appreciate is that government didn't have a natural lever to pull. We could even see them flooding people's social media accounts with fake news. But it's not like we can, as a government, press a button and make that stop or become editor-in-chief of Facebook. So I think what's interesting when I think back on it is, could we have done something, could we have initiated that conversation with the tech platforms earlier in the way that we did around terrorism, where we really did have a mature conversation, and by mature I mean multi-year conversation about what ISIS is doing, what Al-Qaeda is doing, and what can you take down and what do you not take down because of free speech concerns. And frankly, I wish that was a conversation happening now. I don't get the sense that it is happening. I think that tech companies get it, it was a bit. It's not a problem where the U.S. government had a natural solution, but that's all the more reason why I think we could have, and now we need to, be exploring that with the people who can actually solve it, who are outside of government.
Now, Samantha, you were dealing with this issue probably in a very different way in your capacity in the United Nations, but it did come up. There was the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner, and then we heard all sorts of interesting versions about that. The Malaysian airliner that was shot down over Ukraine, probably by a Russian missile, but we won't get into that. And that, I remember, did come up in various ways. I think even Lavrov was sort of, I don't want to say guilty, but he sometimes used these rather dubious narratives in some of his public statements. I mean, how do you respond to this issue? When you look back, did it loom that large, or was it just not that large on your horizon?
Well, Russian hybrid warfare was evident in many, many places.
Sure.
I mean, and I remember, in fact, when our intelligence community came out with their statement saying what Russia had done, this was a huge bombshell, and it was, I think, entirely appropriate that the intelligence community come out with that bombshell because of the ways in which, when President Obama spoke to any issue, really, there was such a large constituency of people who just wanted to say and do the opposite of whatever he wanted to say and do. And so, since it was a technical finding with a strong evidentiary basis when they came out, as Ben said, I think we expected people from both parties to jump up and down and be as seized with this as we were within the executive branch. At the UN, I happened to be out with a group of Eastern European colleagues, and they were like, yeah, tell us something we don't already know, like, welcome to our world.
Yeah.
And, you know, I had a very close working relationship with my Russian counterpart and was able to sort of extract or really pull water from a stone in a way from the Putin administration to get things done, even on hard issues like Syria. Not nearly enough done by any means. But I was used to him, a person I knew and respected offline, just lying baldly. Not whether he was lying, I don't know. I'm sure he believed what his ministry was telling him to say. But it was very disconcerting. I used to, when I was in the Security Council, talk a lot about how I had just entered upside down land. You know, that what was up was down, what was black was white, and vice versa. And then little did I know that my own country and my own president would in effect create and inhabit his own upside down land, right? Where Trump's tweets, which I, have the misfortune, like many others, of reading most days, remind me so much of this kind of diversionary whataboutism, that my Russian counterpart practiced. And it's the oldest trick in the book, I guess. If you are doing something that is not popular or that is problematic, change the subject and, find a way to lash out at your enemies and divide our country. But what's sad is that President Putin's objective has long been to divide our country, and the election interference, I think the intelligence community still assesses, was not even Putin with an eye to defeating Secretary Clinton. I think he didn't think that was likely to be the impact, but it was to pit us against one another, and that's why he supported, neo-Nazi, or his people supported neo-Nazi protests and Black Lives Matter at the same time. The more divisiveness there is in this country, the more the greatest democracy of the world is paralyzed and is at war within itself, and the better that is for a Russia that doesn't prosper in the world that there is. What I never conceived of as a citizen of this amazing country is that my own president would be involved in that tactic as well, dividing us and pitting us against one another.
In the course of the movie, we hear a very solid and reasonable catalog of all the reasons why the administration was not able to do more on Syria. I mean, you guys are very aware of the moral dilemma, and yet we sit here, almost 500,000 people are dead, at least 11 million refugees inside and outside of the country. So what are the things you're saying to yourselves today? Do you feel that just there was no way that the United States could have reasonably involved itself in the conflict in a way to minimize the loss of life, the destruction? Do you still feel comfortable with those answers that you give in the movie, where, for example, you're saying, military intervention of some kind would have made the problems worse? We wouldn't have been able to get other things done with the international community, which is one of the things you mentioned in the movie. Are those answers still satisfying for you? Or perhaps they weren't very satisfying at the time. That's just the way it was.
To speak about the movie, I think one of the things that the movie does is it shows, at least up to a point, the human and the strategic consequences of the war in Syria. So you see the images of people families being torn apart by the conflict. You see the refugee flow. I think it's not explicit at all, but I think one can ask oneself, would there have been Brexit but for that massive flow of people? Would there have been Trump, frankly, because that allowed him to stoke xenophobia and nativism perhaps more than he would have. But the other thing the film shows is the constant effort made. So even though what comes out of our administration, I don't think any of us would deem a success. We tried, for the entire duration of the conflict to do what we could, use our leverage short of military force to end the conflict. We didn't end the conflict. That's not a success. And the heartbreak and the strategic effects are there for everyone to see of the conflict. But to see John Kerry, practically collapsing as he goes up the stairs is to be reminded of America's privilege and its responsibility in the face of such harms to be trying to bring wars to an end. And today, you ask what I think today when I see the film, we did not succeed on Syria. That's obvious. But when I look at John Kerry, I just think, where is that? Where is the diplomacy to try to make things better, to try to end this conflict? We don't even hear about diplomatic initiatives. To my knowledge, there is no contact group. There are photo ops here or there, or summits, where our diplomats are, kind of have to show up and make a statement. But is anybody strenuously trying to bring that conflict to an end? We've defeated ISIS. That's incredibly important. But ISIS was a symptom of a result of the kind of repression and the atrocities and the sense of exclusion in Iraq, in Syria, and other places. I mean, we're going to have ISIS 3.0 or whatever the new version of it if we don't get at the root causes of that conflict. And so I'm in a way juxtaposing at least the effort, not the results, but the effort that Secretary Kerry and others made, in the administration, I think is to be reminded of how important diplomacy is, which is the lost art of this administration, and something President Obama and Ben and others in the film, talk about and prioritize and valued, frankly, more than we had in some time, I think.
I'd just say, I don't. The point, I arrived at in the movie, in year 8 of the administration, having been someone who at various times was for more robust intervention in Syria, the point I was making is, I think President Obama came to a view that there's two questions. There's a question of should we intervene, and how will that work? In other words, can I responsibly put us into this conflict in a way that I think can yield a result that is better? And he tested this proposition long before the film. The film kind of shows where we are at the end of the story, but in 12 and 13 in meetings, and then ultimately when he went to Congress for authorization and wasn't going to get it, let's face it, by the end of that process. And I think he made a judgment that, without congressional support and without any international support except France, no UN mandate, no even British support, with the multiplicity of actors in Syria, the proxy wars, the fact that the Russians and Iranians were all in and arming, so we weren't going to be able to build up a proxy force that could defeat that ultimately you could have a circumstance where we intervene militarily, and the conflict is essentially the same. We're just in it, and you're not. It's counterfactual, and I recognize that. But so I think what we're wrestling with in kind of real time, and what Greg shows is, we're all pained. Nobody's happy with the result. We just, and Samantha, obviously, as the film alludes to, was always pushing for different options. But I think where President Obama came down is that I can't see the option. It's such a large endeavor to go in militarily to take on Assad, and I can't see the option that leads to a better outcome, and I see all the potential risk of that option. I think history should debate this, and I don't think anybody can know that they're right or wrong with any degree of certainty. I will say, when I look back now with some time, one of the things that's interesting is to play back the different moments in the course of the conflict. And it gets so reduced to, should he have bombed after the red line, or should he have armed the opposition at a certain point? But one of the things I I was actually just talking to Samantha about is, what in 2011 was there a diplomatic option that, did we miss some window for diplomacy to say we're going to do something with the Russians and the Europeans and the Arabs to try to stop the civil war before it begins. The debate often gets this kind of binary, military option or not. And what I hope the movie show, what would that John Kerry effort have looked like in 11 or 12, when it was taking place in this context of the Arab Spring seeming to be going in a better direction.
And the first protests in Syria were peaceful.
They were.
And Assad cracked down on peaceful protesters.
And you have to remember at a moment when the peaceful protests had just helped remove Mubarak, we just helped take out Gaddafi. Salah was in Yemen. There was a transition. The analysis was that Assad was cracking, which was wrong. And so again, with the benefit of hindsight, what I hope people do is, if the goal is to both understand what happened, but also to look forward. What do we do in the future here? How can we use diplomacy? Yes, how and when do we use military force to deal with issues like Syria, particularly hard ones when the UN is not going to sanction it because of Russia? But how do we use diplomacy to stop these civil wars from developing? I hope that people look at the full set of options and the full set of the history to consider what lessons we need to draw going forward.
One of the advantages of making documentary films is you can get into some of this nuance. And so, the film is not a policy film in Syria, what actually happened. It's an emotional journey, but as part of that, you feel the emotions at play. And I personally, I think, you all will be thinking about Syria for, a long time, and grappling with it. And often these issues get reduced into red line, yes or no. And in a film, and we have the time to kind of get into kind of the human dynamics and the deep sort of conflicted emotions at play when it comes to policy as well. These are difficult questions being grappled with by real people who have a lot on their plate, and they're make mistakes. Yes, we should criticize. Yes, but I just think I always find it's helpful to look at the human context and what else is going on, and how there's really no, for me, truth lies in the shades of gray, not in the black and white.
But even so, if I were a Syrian, I wouldn't find it that gray.
I mean, I'm not defending anything. I'm not saying, of course, the what's happened in Syria is a sort of absolute tragedy. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when you look at it from how did the U.S. government respond to it, and how did those choices get made? It's like these are human beings making choices.
We didn't realize when Greg came to us to make the film, we didn't know, because who can know these kinds of things, but we didn't know that no film had ever been done opening up the diplomatic apparatus. We still haven't found another country in which such a film has been made, although I think in other countries' foreign policy would probably have a little bit less impact than America's. But nor has there been a documentary about government and the flesh and blood individuals who make up government. I mean, that's kind of interesting and weird. And when you think about the poll numbers for government under Obama, they were bad. Under George W. Bush, they were bad, and under Trump, they're even worse. But our faith in our institutions comes in part because we look at Syria. That's the state of the world as it can get reduced to. And we don't always see as what comes out of this behemoth, right? This big bureaucracy. We don't see the individuals and the incommensurable variables that people are considering. It's not an alibi. Of course not. You're judged. We're going to hold ourselves responsible for what we did and what we didn't do. But I think part of what we're going to need to do looking ahead is rebuild our diplomatic apparatus, which is getting gutted and hollowed out as we speak. And this film, I think, if you're a young person, you see this film, you look at Syria and it motivates you. Look, I want to be a part of solving things like that, instead of thinking about I want to be a part of, cutting the State Department budget or what appear to be the goals of the current administration. So I think this film, even in our darker chapters where no one can claim that we achieve what we set out to achieve on Syria, quite the contrary. But that's the privilege that you get as America, to be Secretary Kerry at the head of a table, pulling countries together, using all tools in the toolbox, testing them, seeing which will work, to try to bring some respite, some relief to people who are suffering around the world. And that matters because our interests are tied up with the interests of people who are suffering in places like that, as I do think our election and you know, the refugee crisis and the impact that migration has had in so many countries, as I think that shows.
One of the